We are launching a deep dive today into a period of history that I think often gets summarized way too quickly,
hmm
or maybe it gets overshadowed by the flashier naval battles that came right before it.
Sure, like Midway.
Exactly. We're going deep into the brutal, desperate, and, well, ultimately decisive campaign for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands.
And we're really focusing on those crucial early months.
Yeah, August to November 1942. This is where a small, almost completely unsupported American Marine force clung to this tiny foothold while all around them, two navies just waged this terrifying war of attrition.
That's right. And we have a stack of sources here that detail everything from the competing grand strategies down to, the logistical nightmares and just the pure visceral fighting that defined this whole period.
And you mentioned Midway. I mean, the popular narrative really tends to focus on the Battle of Midway, 6 weeks earlier, as the definitive turning point of the Pacific War.
And it was. I mean, Midway was undeniably a catastrophic check to Japanese expansion. It restored something, close to parity in carrier power.
4 Japanese fleet carriers lost against 1 American.
Right. A huge blow.
But if Midway was the tactical turning point, what the source material really seems to suggest is that Guadalcanal was the strategic and, maybe more importantly, the psychological turning point.
That's it. Exactly. After Midway, the Japanese military, they still felt they had a chance to win.
Really? Even after losing 4 carriers?
Yes. But after Guadalcanal, that hope was gone.
Wow.
After Midway, the Japanese military machine was, it was still acting like it was on the offensive, still expanding and consolidating territory. Guadalcanal changed that. Fundamentally, it forced them onto a costly, protracted defense, and it was on American terms.
And you see this in the words of the Japanese officers who were actually there.
Oh, it's an overwhelming consensus. You have Captain Toshikazu Ome, who is the operations officer for the 8th Fleet. He stated it plainly. He said, "After Coral Sea and Midway, I still had hope. But after Guadalcanal, I felt that we could not win."
That is just a chilling admission. The optimism that survived losing 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers just evaporates the minute the Marines secure 1 tiny airfield. Why? Why did Guadalcanal land with such force?
It was the relentless material destruction of assets they just couldn't replace.
Hmm.
Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, a really formidable commander, they called him Tanaka the Tenacious, he ran the night supply runs. He was even more direct. He said, "There is no question that Japan's doom was sealed with the closing of the struggle for Guadalcanal."
And for the Army, it was even worse.
Oh, far worse. From their perspective, which suffered most grievously, you have Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, who led the first major counterattack. He called the island simply the graveyard of the Japanese army.
And we'll get into his personal experience, which certainly justifies that statement. But what does this mean in terms of grand strategy? Why did this one island wreck Japan's long-term war goals if Midway was supposed to be the decisive blow?
Well, you have to look at the Japanese long game. Their plan, the whole goal of the Pearl Harbor attack, it wasn't outright victory in a total war against the U.S.
They knew that was impossible.
They knew it. Their goal was to gain time. They believed if they struck America hard, pushed them far back into the Pacific, they could build this impregnable chain of island forts around their new resource-rich empire.
And then what? Force negotiation.
Exactly. America, they reasoned, would get tired of a costly and bloody war and then negotiate a favorable peace.
And Guadalcanal just shattered that dream barely a year after Pearl Harbor.
Completely shattered it. Instead of finding exhausted Americans willing to negotiate, the U.S. was suddenly entrenched deep inside their supposed defensive perimeter, and their faces were turned toward Japan. The strategic initiative had passed permanently.
And crucially, the Japanese were now burning up their most valuable resource veteran pilots, naval ships, on a battle they hadn't even planned for. So I guess we need to understand how the Americans, who were, reeling after Pearl Harbor, managed to put a finger on this obscure little island in the first place and force Japan's hand.
Well, that leads us right into the competing strategic visions that collided in the Solomons.
Okay, let's unpack this. This conflict of vision between the Allied High Command, and particularly Admiral Ernest King, and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. King, the U.S. Navy Commander-in-Chief, he has this incredible reputation in the sources. Respected, but definitely not beloved. And outright hated by roughly half the Anglo-American alliance. We're talking Secretary of War Stimson, Prime Minister Churchill, General Brooke.
King was an absolute curmudgeon, no question, known for his terseness, his temper. But he had this clarity, this vision that was necessary to recognize the immediate threat posed by unchecked Japanese expansion in the South Pacific.
While everyone else was looking at Europe.
Exactly. While others in Washington and London were focused on Operation Bolero, the build-up in England for a future European invasion, King saw what he called a creeping catastrophe.
That's a powerful term. What specifically did he fear?
He was afraid the Japanese would cut the lifeline to Australia, that they would drive eastward toward Hawaii and solidify this massive new empire behind an unbreachable island barrier.
And if they consolidated those gains?
The war would become exponentially harder to win. So King was essentially the only major player forcefully advocating for an immediate offensive in the South Pacific. He was pushing back hard against that Europe First strategy.
And he was urging action when the drumroll of Japanese victories was at its absolute loudest. How did he sell this to President Roosevelt?
As early as January 1942, he was already urging Marshall to occupy more islands. By March, he laid out his strategy to the president. And it was summarized in these three decisive phrases that would guide U.S. naval policy.
What were they?
First, hold Hawaii. Second, support Australasia. And third, drive northwestward from New Hebrides.
And that third point, that's it. The drive northwestward. That was the tentative geographic finger being placed right on the Solomons. But they were moving into Japanese territory at a terrible strategic moment. Why? Why the urgency?
King was acutely aware of time. The Japanese were expanding every single day. And if America waited until the full resources of the home front were mobilized, they might find the door to the Pacific permanently shut.
So his impatience meant they couldn't wait for traditional armies.
Right. They couldn't wait for land armies to be shipped over and trained. They needed a force ready to fight across open beaches immediately, which, of course, justified the U.S. Marine Corps' unique existence and its amphibious warfare doctrine. He needed someone to take the fight to the enemy right now.
So King is all about cold, hard realism. Meanwhile, what's happening in Tokyo is, well, the exact opposite.
A state of victory fever. It was bordering on strategic delirium.
What does that mean?
It was absolute strategic overconfidence. Some officers of the Naval General Staff, riding high on their success, were actually proposing the invasion of Australia itself.
Yeah. Seriously.
Yeah. Cooler heads in the Navy thought it was ridiculous, and the Army General Staff, they thought it was impossible. They calculated they couldn't possibly scrape together the 10 divisions required for an invasion like that.
That internal friction is just fascinating. Why couldn't the Army spare the troops?
There was this deep-seated strategic suspicion that just permeated the Japanese military high command. The Army, even though it was engaged in China and Southeast Asia, was actually hoarding troops.
For what?
They viewed the Soviet Union as their #1 potential enemy. So they were preparing for a conflict against Russia, not a prolonged island-hopping campaign against the U.S.
Wow.
And that fracture meant that critical resources were prioritized for a continental threat that never materialized, which left them critically under-resourced for the naval war.
So Japan is strategically fractured, focused on Russia and Port Moresby, while King is laser-focused on the Solomons. And this brings us to Admiral Yamamoto, who seems to have demonstrated some foresight even in the middle of all this chaos.
Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was perhaps their most realistic commander. He had famously written to a friend that Japan had no hope of victory unless the armistice was dictated from the White House.
Meaning he knew they couldn't win a long war of resources.
He knew. Against the U.S. industrial machine, no chance. His strategy was all about crippling the U.S. decisively, right at the start.
And he proposed the Midway operation as the solution to force that one decisive battle.
Exactly. He argued that the most effective way to sever the U.S.-Australia supply line wasn't through, localized island seizure, but by luring and destroying the remaining enemy carrier forces at Midway. He was determined that his plan should carry, despite some initial apprehension for the Naval General Staff.
They were reluctant to risk the fleet.
They were very reluctant to use their precious carrier fleet so far from home.
But then something happened in April of '42 that moved Midway from just a daring plan to a paramount, urgent operation.
The Doolittle Raid.
Help us understand why a small, relatively insignificant bombing run was so strategically and, I guess, culturally impactful.
The Doolittle Raid, launched from Halsey's task force, was a profound shock to the Japanese psyche. For the first time, bombs fell on the sacred homeland.
And this wounded their pride.
It wounded the pride of the Naval General Staff so deeply that Yamamoto himself felt such shame he called on Emperor Hirohito to apologize personally. It just shattered the national conviction that the home islands were inviolable.
And so that made Midway paramount.
Paramount and urgent. The Americans had to be pushed back so far that such an insult could never happen again.
That urgency pushed Midway forward. But tell us about the characteristic inflexibility of the naval general staff, as the sources describe it, because that ultimately sealed Guadalcanal's fate.
Right. Despite the overwhelming focus on Midway, the naval general staff showing that kind of bureaucratic rigidity that's common to militaries, they blandly continued their prior operation to isolate Australia.
Which involved
Seizing Port Moresby, which failed at the Coral Sea, and seizing Tulagi in the Southern Solomons. They were operating on this national conviction that a course undertaken must be followed. So even as their focus shifted east to Midway, they were unknowingly drawing closer to the chain of islands that contained Guadalcanal by focusing on Tulagi, just across a narrow strait.
That sounds like a catastrophic strategic irony. Yamamoto's genius gives Japan a chance at Midway, but the naval staff's bureaucratic rigidity, coupled with the insult of the Doolittle raid, means they start building a critical airbase on Guadalcanal.
Completely oblivious to its future importance to the Americans.
It's a total paradox.
It is. The planners in Tokyo, in their victory fever and administrative inflexibility, had pointed their baton straight at Guadalcanal without even realizing the island's potential. They were aiming for Tulagi, which had the good harbor, but Guadalcanal, which offered a flat coastal plain perfect for a major airfield that was deemed secondary. And that secondary objective became the core of the American offensive.
So the strategic stage is set. Admiral King is demanding action now. But how could the U.S. possibly deliver an amphibious invasion on such short notice, especially given that this type of warfare had been viewed as near impossible since the disaster at Gallipoli?
This is where the U.S. Marine Corps' decades-long fight for its own survival really pays off. Between the wars, they were fighting for their very existence against powerful Army generals and Navy admirals who saw them as mere beach jumpers.
Or the Navy's police force.
Exactly. A term President Truman himself later realized was brutally inaccurate, but it reflected the low esteem they were held in.
So they had to create the very doctrine that would save them.
That's it. To justify their existence, the Marines persevered and developed the theory of amphibious warfare. They rejected the old dictum that hostile defended shores couldn't be seized from the sea without capturing established port facilities.
They argued you could go right over the beaches.
Right over open beaches, and that you needed specialized gear to do it. So they encouraged these vital innovators like Andrew Higgins, who developed the ubiquitous landing craft, and Donald Roebling, who gave them the forerunner of the Amtrak, that tracked vehicle that could crawl over land obstacles and swamps.
And this rigorous preparation was combined with some very crucial practical experience.
That's true. The Banana Wars in Haiti and Nicaragua gave them crucial, if bloody, jungle warfare training.
Things like close quarters fighting, patrols.
And living off the land in the tropics.
Yeah.
And then duty in China taught them the most valuable lesson of all. Never, ever underestimate the tenacity, the preparation, or the resolve of the Japanese soldier.
And this hard school produced seasoned professionals like Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift. What kind of man was he tasked with leading this impossible mission?
Vandegrift was Old Virginia stock, a 33-year veteran known for his calm, quiet demeanor and just absolute competence. He took command of the 1st Marine Division, 19,000 men, in March 1942, charged with forging this amphibious striking force, and he was getting what our sources call the new breed.
Who were these new Marines?
They were angry youths, late teens, early 20s, who just stormed the recruiting centers after Pearl Harbor. They knew almost nothing about war, but they were fueled by this raw, primitive anger over the enemy's infamy.
They were described as tough guys.
Tough guys whose instincts were aroused by the need for vengeance. Our sources include that really striking anecdote about the youth who insisted on getting circumcised.
That story really illustrates the visceral fury they brought. He was told he couldn't be accepted unless he was circumcised to conform to health standards, and he just burst out, "Circumcised? What in hell do you think I'm going to do to the enemy?"
That sheer, unforgiving desire to inflict damage was the psychological temper they brought to the old breed, and their training, held in the miserable boondocks at New River, North Carolina, it was crude. They suffered from notoriously bad food-powdered eggs and that awful boiled boondocker counterfeit Swiss steak. But this experience fostered a fierce esprit de corps.
It built a bond.
It did. They developed a swagger and a cynical humor, engaging in constant interfamilial brawling squad versus squad to foster this marine mystique that anyone behind the point man was contemptuously deemed a rear echelon bastard.
That sounds like an effective but terrifying psychological crucible designed to prepare them for the absolute worst.
It was.
Now let's talk about the island they were heading toward and the critical geography they would soon be fighting over.
Guadalcanal itself was about 90 miles long, 25 miles wide. It had steep mountains on the southern coast where the surf just pounded eternally, which made landing impossible.
But the northern coast was different.
The northern coast offered this gentle shore of white beaches and coconut palms. It was boat-friendly, with flat land perfect for construction.
And it had this beautiful exotic Spanish name.
Indeed. But the Japanese pilots, who struggled with the exotic L sound, they consistently referred to their enchanted island as Katakana.
And this area immediately became a strategic nightmare.
Oh, because of the narrow waterways. The strip of water separating Guadalcanal from Florida Island and Savo Island became known as the Slot, which was the Japanese route for reinforcing the island.
And the water surrounding Guadalcanal?
Where so many ships would sink, earned the grim moniker, Iron Bottom Bay.
So anyone trying to supply the island, whether Japanese or American, had to run this terrifying gauntlet of the Slot and risk sinking in Iron Bottom Bay. This brings us to the crucial intelligence network that made the U.S. invasion possible in the first place, the Coast Watchers.
This Australian-led network, headed by Commander Eric Felt, was a critical human element. It was made up of independent islanders, planters, gold miners, ship captains, even some unmitigated scamps.
And they were chosen because they scorned conformity.
They scorned conformity and possessed the ferocity of the free man. They were willing to stay behind Japanese lines.
And their highly descriptive, colorful language is legendary, too.
Their pidgin English was priceless.
Yeah.
I mean, our sources record them describing Ashes as shit-blong fire and reporting an enemy bombing raid as Japan, he shit along sky. But their information was golden, and it was delivered via clandestine radio from the depths of the bush.
We absolutely have to highlight Martin Clemens, the former district officer who remained behind on Guadalcanal itself.
Clemens was the eyes and ears on the ground. He was totally isolated, facing both the Japanese occupation and all the internal pressures of the island. He had to deal with wavering native loyalty and Catholic missionaries like Father Engberink and Father Duhamel, who insisted on neutrality, believing the war wasn't their concern.
So he was trying to deny resources to the enemy while fundamentally alone.
And his solution was to develop a superb spy network.
How did he manage that?
He stripped his native scouts of their colonial badges, and he instructed them to just mingle with the Japanese, work for them, spy, and report back on everything.
And the information was incredibly specific.
Unbelievably specific. Reporting on ships, for example. One fellow cruiser got him gun-long 6-inch. They even managed to identify the Japanese petty officer in charge of construction, a Mr. Ishimoto, who was a former Lever Brothers carpenter, now returning as a conqueror.
And it was a native scout who gave the first real numbers.
Right, a scout named Dobu, who first reported 1,000 Japanese at Lunga, counting them meticulously by collecting 10 stones in his hand.
So the intelligence was flowing, the doctrine was set, but the Marines were about to be thrown into battle far sooner and far less prepared than anyone could have ever planned for.
The timeline that Vandegrift was handed was, well, it was physically impossible. He'd expected his division to be ready by the end of the year. Instead, after months of crew training in North Carolina, he was notified in April he was shipping out to New Zealand for yet more training.
And then?
Then, on June 25th, he met Admiral Gormley and received the Joint Chiefs Directive. Seize Kalagi and Guadalcanal by August 1st.
5 weeks. To prepare for the first major American offensive of the entire war, that is an astonishing demand.
Vandegrift was astounded. He protested vehemently. He pointed out his division was fragmented, a third in Samoa, a third at sea, a third in Wellington. He said they were untrained for a combat landing, and he knew nothing of the island's defenses.
But King's directive was final.
It was final. Seize the airfield before the Japanese could finish it and make it operational. So the immediate task became pure logistics. They had to unscramble the massive piles of supplies dumped haphazardly in Wellington and, crucially, combat load them.
Explain what combat loading means in this context.
It means loading your supplies so that the necessary items are available first when the ships hit the beach. Gasoline, ammunition, water, that should be near the top. But in Wellington, everything had been tossed indiscriminately. So to combat load meant spending weeks sorting and reorganizing thousands of tons of cargo, knowing that if it wasn't done perfectly, The men on the beach would die because the ammunition was buried beneath the powdered eggs.
And while the Americans were scrambling in this panic, the Japanese, operating with that same supreme confidence, just continued their buildup.
They did. By early June, their scouting parties, including Ishimoto, were at Lunga. The Japanese army commander, General Haruyoshi Hyakutake, paid absolutely no attention to the big island of Guadalcanal.
He was focused on Port Moresby.
Entirely. On the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. He was completely unaware that the Navy was even building an airfield there, a profound communication breakdown that would cost Japan everything. They expected the Americans to attack Rabaul, not this irrelevant speck.
Then came the landings, August 7th, 1942.
The American objectives were Tulagi, for its excellent anchorage, the heavily fortified twin islets of Gavututena, Ogo, and Lunga Point on Guadalcanal to seize the airfield. Vandergrift decided to land east of the Ilu River to avoid reported enemy guns near the Lunga.
And they met immediate resistance.
On Tulagi, yes, immediate fierce defense. Japanese sailors of the Yokohama Air Group sought to save their blazing Kawanishi flying boats, which were caught on the surface like sitting ducks.
And the fight for Gabututanabogo was hellish from the start.
It was. Marines of the 1st Parachute Battalion stormed these tiny fortified islets, and they were immediately pinned down at the seaplane pier, taking fire from 3 sides. These were not the easy landings the Marines had hoped for. The Japanese were dug in and ready to fight to the last man.
But the critical thing that saved the Marines that first day was the warning from the air.
Thanks to those intrepid coast watchers.
Yeah.
They delivered life-saving intelligence. Paul Mason and Jack Reed spotted and reported 24 torpedo bombers escorted by Zeros heading south toward the landing fleet. This gave the American fleet time to prepare.
And we had that classic quote from the Australian cruiser Canberra.
A great example of that stiff upper lip, they announced. The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11 o'clock.
Classic defiance.
Yeah.
But that ensuing air battle was a harbinger of the kind of desperate high-stakes fighting that was to come.
It was. The attack involved the Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who was nearly killed. He flew for 5 hours after being wounded, blinded in one eye, and having the sticky mix of blood and soda from his exploding soda bottle gum up his vision. He had to rub the mixture away to see dimly, navigating back to Rabaul solely by recognizing a horseshoe-shaped island.
Wow.
His Zero was riddled by wildcats. That 5-hour survival flight was the longest fighter mission in history, and it really demonstrated the tenacity that the Americans were about to face.
Despite the initial air victory, the day after the successful landings brought the true catastrophe, the Battle of Savo Island, the night the supporting fleet was left.
Bare ass. That phrase came directly from Admiral Turner himself.
And the failure was just a cascade of compounding errors.
It was. First, Admiral Fletcher abruptly withdrew his carriers, citing risk and adhering to the principle of calculated risk with his precious remaining carriers. Then Turner informed Vandegrift and Admiral Crutchley that he was leaving in the morning, taking the transports with him. This left the heavy cruisers to defend the landing zone in Iron Bottom Bay.
Why did the naval defense fail so spectacularly? How did Vice Admiral Mikawa's fleet just sail unopposed into the bay?
Mikawa's 8th Fleet 7 heavy cruisers, including his flagship Chokai, was sailing down the slot. Crucially, Mikawa was sighted twice by Allied air reconnaissance, but the reports were either filed too late or they were misinterpreted.
And there was that damning failure with the Australian pilot.
The most damning failure. The pilot who sighted Mikawa, he flew another 4 hours back to base and, in a shocking moment of peacetime routine, stopped to have tea before filing his report. That 8-hour delay was catastrophic.
Unbelievable. So Mikawa, using the cover of darkness, was practically unopposed.
He was. Crutchley, commanding the Western Defense Force, divided his 6 heavy cruisers, believing they'd be unwieldy at night. Mikawa, guided by superior Japanese night tactics, the boast being that American blue eyes are no match for our dark eyes in night actions, slipped past 2 radar-equipped destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot.
And the Blue actually reversed course just as he approached.
Right, failing to register the enemy contact.
And when Mikawa struck.
He struck with devastating speed at 1:25 a.m., unleashing a storm of torpedoes and gunfire. The shock was absolute. Within minutes, the Southern force was blasted and routed. The U.S. Navy lost 4 heavy cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and the Australian Canberra, and 1 destroyer. It was a humiliating tactical defeat.
But Mikawa, despite this crushing victory, did not attack the transports. They were sitting ducks in the bay. Why did he turn back?
This is where you see the profound operational impact of Midway. Mikawa was absolutely paralyzed by the Japanese Navy's crippling fear of American air power at dawn. He'd just seen 4 carriers wiped out.
So he chose tactical survival over strategic victory.
He did. He turned back for Rabaul at 2:40 a.m., missing the opportunity to destroy the vulnerable transports and their cargo. Had he done so, the Marines would have been utterly doomed and Guadalcanal would have been an Allied defeat.
So American air power, even though it was largely absent, dictated the decisive moment. It saved the transports, which then sailed away, leaving 17,000 Marines alone on Guadalcanal, surrounded by their haphazardly dumped supplies.
On August 9th, with the Navy gone and the waters choked with wreckage, Vandegrift informed his men they were all alone. His plan was simple and desperate. Organize the defense, finish the airfield, soon to be named Henderson Field, get the supplies inland, and patrol relentlessly.
The logistics of being abandoned must have been crippling. You mentioned the supply crisis. How bad was the situation on the beach?
It was entirely out of hand.
Huh.
The supplies that hadn't been combat loaded properly in Wellington were a total mess. Untrained coxswains had mixed medical supplies with engine parts. And the Marines, who saw themselves as combat troops trained for the spearhead, they refused to help the shore parties.
What were they doing?
Cracking coconut, swimming in the bay, telling the laboring crews, "We're combat troops, Mac. You unload the goddamn stuff." Supplies just lay in these massive, vulnerable piles, prime targets for any Japanese air raid.
Yet they maintained a defiant, if ignorantly blissful morale.
Very much so. The swaggering new breed, renamed Savo, the Battle of the 5 Sitting Ducks. They talked confidently of being relieved by the Army, the lowly dog faces, in 3 weeks, and then they'd go back to New Zealand for steak and eggs.
They just didn't grasp the gravity of their isolation.
Or the strategic importance of the battle they were now fighting? Not at all.
And the Japanese high command, still receiving these exaggerated victory claims from Savo, failed to realize the strength of the foothold. They believed the American presence was small, maybe 2,000 men, and intended only to destroy the airfield and withdraw.
This profound miscalculation led directly to the first major land clash, the Ichiki detachment at the Tanaru River. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, who was supposed to have captured Midway, landed 900 crack troops at Taivu Point, 22 miles east of the perimeter, on August 18th.
And his contempt for the Americans was absolute. It fueled his rash decision to attack immediately.
He was incredibly arrogant. He relied on what he called bamboo spear tactics and spiritual power, believing Westerners were very effeminate and very cowardly, especially at night. He ignored his orders to wait for the rest of his troops. His goal was to achieve instant glory and annihilate the few Marines he believed were there.
But this rash confidence was countered by the ultimate act of loyalty and defiance from Sergeant Major Vuza.
Vuza was out scouting for Clemens when he was captured, tortured, bayoneted in the throat by the Japanese, but he refused to answer questions. He chewed through his ropes, crawled half a mile, and warned Colonel Pollock just before midnight. This miraculous survival gave the Marines just enough time to prepare.
And Ichi charged straight into a prepared defense across the sandspit.
He did. He charged across the sandspit, crossing the Ilu River, a spot the Americans mistook for the larger Tenero River, which is the name the battle is remembered by. Marine fire just struck them down, stacking their bodies high against the barbed wire.
And the Marines were inflamed by the recent Good Patrol massacre.
Right. Where wounded American intelligence officers had been chopped up by Japanese sabers, they fought with absolute vengeful fury. They granted no quarter.
So, Ichiki's reliance on spiritual power was met by the cold material reality of Marine machine guns.
An exact and fatal contrast. Vandegrift's reserve battalion swung the flank, trapping the Japanese against the sea and the river. Colonel Ichiki burned his colors and committed suicide. The detachment was annihilated. Only a handful of prisoners were taken. General Hyakutake was forced to notify Tokyo that the attack was not entirely successful, the understatement of the war.
This first defeat didn't deter the Japanese, though. It just increased the size and desperation of the next counterattacks. And next came Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi and the pivotal Battle of Bloody Ridge in September.
Kawaguchi arrived with 5,000 Borneo veterans. He planned this stealthy, difficult approach via the Maruyama Road through the dense jungle to hit the Americans from the south, aiming for the critical, undefended hog-backed ridge leading straight to Henderson Field. He, too, relied heavily on the belief in spiritual power to overcome the American defenses.
But Marine intelligence proved too quick for him again, thanks to a bold raid and the immediate recognition of the threat.
Colonel Red Mike Edson, commanding the raiders, launched a highly successful raid on Kawaguchi's supply base at Tasimboko. They captured documents that revealed the major attack was imminent from the south, not the more expected west.
So Edson knew where to go.
He did. Edson, recognizing the southern ridge was the key to the entire perimeter, immediately moved his exhausted raiders to that critical high ground just in time.
And Kawaguchi's massive, stealthy approach through the jungle actually became his primary downfall. It slowed the attack and scattered his forces.
The jungle proved to be a malevolent green labyrinth. His men were delayed 5 days, sloshing through armpit-deep swamps, clawing through tangles, unable to coordinate their efforts. When the attack finally launched over 2 terrifying nights, September 12th to 14th, the Japanese screamed, "Banzai!" and "Marine, you die!" as they charged uphill in waves. They drove the raiders back, but could never break the line.
This was where the American commitment to overwhelming firepower, the material component, proved its absolute worth against sheer human wave attacks driven by devotion.
It was absolutely vital. Every gun and every Marine on Guadalcanal was committed. The Marine artillery, especially the 105mm howitzers, provided crucial close-range support. Their unexpected and massive barrages forced the Japanese attackers to mill and stack up, providing easy targets. The noise and the destruction just broke the momentum of the Banzai charges. By the second night, the Marines held the ridge.
And the cost to the Japanese army.
General Kawaguchi, defeated and enraged by the failure of his coordinated plan, was forced to begin an agonizing, disorganized retreat through the jungle toward the Matanakal. Thousands of his men died not from combat wounds, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion during that retreat. Bloody Ridge, now Edson's Ridge, held, saving Henderson Field and proving definitively that the Marines could win a defensive land battle against a determined, numerically superior foe.
The success at Bloody Ridge bought them time, but the fighting didn't stop. It just morphed into this sustained, desperate war of attrition, fought by the pilots of the Cactus Air Force and the few naval assets brave enough or foolish enough to enter Iron Bottom Bay.
This was the relentless 247 siege of Guadalcanal. The CA pilots, they lived in tents near Henderson Field, which was the Japanese bullseye. Their life was a cycle of oppressive mud, choking black dust, vitaminless diets causing aching fatigue, and just the sheer terror of nightly shelling.
And we have those wonderfully colorful names for the nightly disturbances.
Yes, the shelling came courtesy of Washing Machine Charlie, the lone bombers whose offbeat motors you could hear for miles, and Luz the Louse, the cruiser scout planes that dropped blinding flares to mark targets. The pilots rarely slept soundly.
The logistics of keeping the CI flying under these conditions sound almost prehistoric.
It was laughably primitive compared to modern air bases. Dauntless dive bombers and Wildcats, they had to be refueled manually using 55-gallon drums, a hand pump, and a chamois strainer. It was a slow, back-breaking operation that took hours. Bombs had to be lugged and loaded by hand, as there were virtually no mechanical hoists.
Yet they kept flying.
CF was constantly depleted by Zeros and crashes on the shell-pocked runways, yet they managed to impose serious damage on the Japanese.
A small boost came with new leadership. Brigadier General Roy Geiger, Vandergrift's old friend, took command.
Geiger, a veteran air officer, brought immediate urgency and a notoriously harsh temper. There's a wonderful anecdote about his arrival. Geiger, who preferred Scotch, brought a rare case of bourbon to trade Vandergrift, who preferred bourbon, for the rare case of Scotch Vandergrift had received, only to find Geiger's bourbon had been stolen by his pink-cheeked flyboys. Vandergrift kept the Scotch, but gave Geiger 2 bottles, which only fueled Geiger's resolve to drive his pilots harder.
He also led by example.
He did, lumbering into a dauntless cockpit at the age of 57 to drop a 1,000-pounder on a Japanese assembly point.
While the CAF fought for survival by day, the Japanese owned the night with the Tokyo Express running supplies down the slot.
These were the relentless, fast supply runs using destroyers, often commanded by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka the Tenacious. The Japanese supply efforts were so grim that the command assigned the code word RAT to the supply runs.
Right.
And Commander Hara, a destroyer captain under Tanaka, he internalized this. He was watching a Falcon, the American dive bomber, attack a RAT, a Japanese destroyer in a cage, reflecting the reality of their dangerous mission.
Why didn't the Japanese use larger transports?
They learned quickly that large, slow transports were just too vulnerable to the Cactus Air Force during daylight hours. Destroyers were fast enough to unload troops and supplies under the cover of night and retreat before dawn. Tanaka consistently managed to get troops and supplies ashore despite American airstrikes. But the cost was brutal.
It was.
His initial troop transport, Meo Maru, was sunk by a submarine, and eventually, after the failure of the major reinforcement effort, Operation Ka Tanaka was relieved of command. A reward, as our source notes, often reserved for an accurate prophet of doom.
The ultimate low point for the Americans was the night the battleships arrives in October. This is where the concept of spiritual power was finally matched by the material weight of Japanese naval firepower.
October 13th to 14th. The Japanese, aiming to crush CAF before the Sendai Division attacked, sent battleships Kongo and Haruna to bombard Henderson Field. This 90-minute shelling was the worst Americans experienced in WWII. It was a terror of the soul.
The sources describe men just sobbing in their foxholes.
Sobbing or whimpering, feeling the concussion need their stomachs, and hearing the monster clanging as 14-inch salvos crashed in.
They were utterly defenseless against those heavy shells. What was the damage?
41 men, many of them irreplaceable pilots and ground crew, were killed. Planes were blown up, crushed, set afire. CF was temporarily rendered non-operational, with just enough working planes to send an urgent message requesting 20 bombers immediately.
So the Navy had to suffer desperately, far from the island, just to keep the Marines alive and resupplied.
The Navy paid in blood for every single day the Marines held. The torpedoing of the carrier Wasp by a Japanese submarine, the subsequent damage to Enterprise in North Carolina, and later the loss of Hornet during the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands.
But Santa Cruz had a silver lining for the Americans.
A huge one. Though the Japanese claimed a great tactical victory, they suffered a massive strategic loss. Over 100 aircraft and their precious veteran pilots were lost, ensuring their carrier-based aircraft would no longer be a major factor in the final battles for Guadalcanal.
That sets the stage for the crucial naval climax in mid-November, the definitive naval battle of Guadalcanal.
This battle determined everything. The Japanese attempted a massive reinforcement and resupply effort, backed by powerful capital ships, specifically with the goal of crushing the American naval presence and securing the landing of the Sendai Division. In 2 desperate, confused nights of close-range fighting, the Americans absorbed heavy losses.
Losing 2 cruisers.
2 cruisers, including the light cruiser Atlanta and the unlucky Juno, which was torpedoed while retreating, killing the 5 Sullivan brothers. They lost 5 destroyers in total.
But the result was a strategic victory that outweighed the massive tactical losses.
Absolutely. The U.S. Navy, through sheer tenacity and aggressive night fighting by Task Force 67, annihilated the Japanese reinforcement effort. They sank 2 battleships, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, and critically, 11 slow troop transports. This destruction destroyed most of the 38th Division reinforcements, ensuring that the Sendai Division's efforts would be the final major army effort Japan could muster. It was the naval victory that truly guaranteed the Marines' survival.
So, with the Japanese naval reinforcement effort shattered, the ultimate ground crisis came with the arrival and the subsequent torment of Lieutenant General Masao Moriyama's 2nd, or Sendai Division. 7,000 men, considered one of the most illustrious units in the Imperial Army.
They were supposed to be the decisive force, the unit that would sweep the Americans into the sea. But their march to the battle zone was a literal descent into hell. They took the Moriyama Road through what was described as a malevolent green labyrinth, a trackless jungle.
Described the horror of that march. It lasted for days, and it broke the division before they even saw the enemy.
It was an unimaginable ordeal. They were delayed 5 days, marching on half rations, clawing through slime, waist-deep mud, tangles of vine. They tried to maintain morale by turning toward the Emperor each morning and singing the ancient battle oath. Corpses drifting swollen, corpses rotting in the mountain grass. We shall die for the Emperor.
They were fueled by that devotion.
But starved by the logistics.
And Maruyama, for his part, he was furious that his fresh troops were mingling with the wretched, disease-ridden veterans of Kawaguchi's failed campaign.
Who were spreading tales of horror.
Right.
So he had to fight demoralization as much as he was fighting the jungle. Maruyama tried to combat this with his general order. Do not expect to return, not even 1 man if the occupation is not successful. Everyone must remember the honor of the Emperor, fear no enemy, yield to no material matters. But the jungle had already done its damage, scattering forces and delaying the synchronized attack.
The October offensive, from October 24th to 26th, was the final concentrated assault on the southern perimeter of Henderson Field. And this is where Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller cemented his legend.
Chesty Puller, a man defined by sheer will and his booming voice, commanded a massive sector, spreading his forces thin. His men boasted, "We don't need no communication system, we got Chesty." The Japanese charged in relentless waves, described as a death swarming into marine steel. Again, they came without adequate artillery preparation or maps, demonstrating a vaingloriously suicidal determination, just trying to overwhelm the line by sheer weight of bodies.
The stories from that night, including Strant Mitchell Page earning the Medal of Honor, define the Marine refusal to yield.
Page fought alone for hours after his machine gun section was wiped out, repelling wave after wave of attackers trying to break the line, keeping his gun firing until the position was safe. The Marine line held against the best the Emperor could send, and in the middle of this onslaught, the Americans received desperately needed Army reinforcement.
Soldiers completely unfamiliar with the jungle brought in mid-battle.
Yes, the soldiers of the 164th Infantry, Colonel Hall's men. They were marched from their bivouac behind the Tenaru, sloshing through the dark, guided by a Navy chaplain, Father Keough, who was the only one who knew the narrow path. Puller, meeting them, immediately asserted command, telling Hall, "I'll be in command until daylight at least, because I know what's going on here and you don't." Those green soldiers were filtered into the line and they held alongside the exhausted Marines.
Beyond the fighting, the psychological and physical cost was just devastating. The enemy wasn't just the Japanese, it was the climate and the diseases.
The island itself was an active antagonist. Disease was rampant, and it quickly eclipsed combat losses. In the 1st Marine Division, malaria cases jumped from a few hundred in September to 1,941 in October, and then a staggering 3,200 in November.
And that's just malaria.
That's just malaria. They also suffered dengue fever, dysentery, tropical ulcers, fungus rot. They were emaciated by vitaminless diets, often subsisting on wormy rice and believing the yellow adiprene pills they took made them impotent.
And they felt utterly abandoned by the world.
There was an aching, utter loneliness, a feeling of expendability. They were tortured by news of labor strikes at home or ships lying unloaded in the bay because merchant seamen wanted extra pay. They became tribal, clinging to their foxholes. They even developed a primitive dread, believing that their foxholes kept them safe from the tutelary god of the island, a reflection of how the terror had stripped away the vesture of civilization.
But that grim, black humor persisted. It was their final defense mechanism.
Absolutely. The sarcasm was thick. They cursed everything, from the barbed wire to the female Anopheles mosquito. Private Phil Chaffee, who notoriously went on patrol to hunt for gold teeth, came back one day from Grassy Knoll, claiming he shot 2 Japs with the 1 bullet. It was a cynical, desperate humor of men who had seen too much.
When the 1st Marine Division was finally evacuated in December and January, what did they look like when they left that poisonous green hag of an island?
They were gaunt, bearded, and bony. Many had barely the strength to walk to the boats. Our sources note that the sailors, seeing their condition, were weeping openly, hauling them aboard cargo nets. The men struggled to their feet for one last poignant look at the battlefield, that island that had, for better or worse, made them warriors. As one Marine reported, "One more Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell."
Guadalcanal was a grueling 6-month demonstration that American commitment, superior logistical capacity, despite massive initial failures like Savo Island and the loading chaos, and sheer human resilience, could overcome a profoundly dedicated expansionist enemy, Japan's insistence on the spiritual power of its troops.
Right.
A belief that led Colonel Ichiki, General Kawaguchi, and General Maruyama to send men charging into prepared machine gun fire that cost them irreplaceable assets, veteran pilots, 3 major naval defeats, and the decimation of elite divisions like the Sendai. They sacrificed their remaining offensive power, the pilots and ships they needed to prosecute a long war on an island they initially dismissed as insignificant.
Okay.
That catastrophic failure to assess the material threat meant the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Americans, turning King's desperate finger-pointing into the solid foothold for ultimate victory.
And that profound cultural gap, the Japanese commanders valuing absolute obedience and suicidal determination versus the American troops who were fueled by anger, sarcasm, fierce loyalty to each other, and a stubborn refusal to die, that turned a disastrous, ill-prepared operation into the foothold for ultimate victory. It showed that the American new breed, supported by overwhelming firepower, would absorb and return the violence necessary to win.
And the conflict revealed this profound contradiction at the heart of the American war effort that I think is critical for us to remember. These Marines endured the aching, utter loneliness and survived on wormy rice while fighting a total war on behalf of a democracy that seemed at times indifferent to their sacrifice. A democracy where the press could carelessly compromise their position and labor disputes held up supplies. They served their time in hell, yet they were fighting for the ideals and freedoms enjoyed by a home front that often seemed utterly disconnected from their suffering.
It raises a powerful final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Consider how the U.S. won the war production and resources, but the critical first victory at Guadalcanal was won by the sheer capacity of the average, sarcastic, cynical Marine, the new breed, to endure and fight back, even when they felt totally abandoned. They held the line not for the grand strategy conceived by Admiral King, but for the man in the foxhole next to them.